Welcome to Vox. If you're new, my name is Justin. I'm the lead pastor. Thanks for being a part of our services today. It really is an honor to have you. We've been in a teaching series looking at some of the more challenging topics of our world and some of the things that, so often are not talked about in church, and asking that question, what does it look like to be a community that is in the world and not of the world? What does it mean for the church to be an alternate community? And throughout history, you find that the church has been celebrated and accepted in certain moments and then rejected and condemned in others. Like, for example, in the early church, right, the Romans loved the idea that Christians would take care of the poor, but they hated the idea that Christians wouldn't bow down to Caesar, and they said Jesus is Lord. And so they didn't know what to do with these peculiar people. Well, so it is in our time, and we've been looking at some of the challenges in our world of technology. How does a follower of Christ interact with technology? We've been looking at the issues of race, justice, politics, all these challenging issues, saying, how do we live in the world and how do we not live of the world? What does it look like to really be that alternate community? And so today's the final week. Next week is Palm Sunday and then Easter. So this is the final week of our Altogether Separate series. And today we are talking about the topic of sex. Might feel a little strange to talk about sex at church, but it shouldn't feel strange because the Bible actually has a ton to say about it, and it's essential that we consider and reflect on what is said, because what we think and how we act in this area largely shapes our lives. And so today's sermon is a PG-13 rating, and so parents, if you'd prefer your kids to be in Vox Kids, now is your chance to go and put them in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 is our text, the Apostle Paul writing to the church in Corinth. And this is right in the middle of the letter. He says, all things are lawful for me. Not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord for the body. And God raised the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it's written, the two will become one flesh. But he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body's a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, that you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. This is God's Word, part 4 of our teaching series, Altogether Separate. We're going to call it Finding True Love. Finding True Love. Let's pray. Let's open our hearts to God. Lord, we just thank you for this opportunity to study the Bible together and to wrestle with the scripture. And we just open our hearts right now. And I pray, Lord, that you would speak to us. God, we are not interested in hearing the ideas or the concepts of a human. We want to know the mind of God. And so I just pray that you would unveil it to us as we wrestle, reflect, think about some of the more confusing parts of this text. Would you speak to us, Lord? We open our hearts in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. You know, a compass points north. I don't know if you know how to use a compass. A lot of people don't, but there's a little red dial on this compass, and it is controlled by a magnet, and that magnet connects with the magnetized world that we live in, and it points in a particular direction, and that direction is north. Okay, so the red point of the compass always points north, and so the idea is you line up the compass with north, and then you head north. And when you know north, you know everything. And you know, never eat shredded wheat, right? You know, east, south, west, right? So you know all the directions because a compass gives you the one direction, right? It gives you that one direction because it always points north, except when it doesn't. Except when it doesn't. See, a compass can actually struggle at times. If there are iron deposits in the ground under you, it can cause your compass to give you a false reading. If you get close enough to some type of electric or electronic device, it can cause a compass to give you a false reading. If you're nearby a large metal object, it can cause your compass to give you a false reading, and you'll find yourself moving in the wrong direction. North was that way, all of a sudden now it's this way, because something in your compass was changed by the environment around you. Maybe the most challenging thing that a compass faces is what are known as blackout zones. Blackout zones are parts of the earth that the compass just spins. It just doesn't work at all. Usually in the poles in the north or the south, this happens. And so if a plane, for example, is flying over one of these blackout zones, it can lose its navigational system pretty quickly when it's only based on a compass. And so this is obviously very dangerous, and it's caused many travelers to be aware of the fact that when I hit a blackout zone, sometimes west is east and north is south, and I might think it's one direction, but it might actually be the other direction. And it's possible to think you're going north, to think you're heading home, only to discover miles and miles and miles into the journey that you weren't heading home at all. And so 1 Corinthians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul is trying to teach followers of Christ how to navigate life with this compass called the human heart. That the human heart can guide us into all kinds of things, right? And it's often reliable and sometimes unreliable. And so the human heart might tell me this is good, but it ends up killing me. The human heart might tell me this is right, but it ends up wrong. The human heart might tell me that this is love, but in the end, I find myself broken. And so the heart sometimes hits a blackout zone. The heart, maybe more than any other area in our lives, tends to hit a blackout zone in this area of sexuality. And so 4 times in 11 verses, the Apostle Paul says, do you not know? Do you not know? And he says that because he wants us to realize that there are things that we think we know that we don't know. There are things that we think come naturally to us, but are actually not God's intention for our lives. And so some of the assumptions we make, some of the things that we think aren't yet changed by God's word. And so in chapter 6 and 7, he deals with the 2 competing views around human sexuality, okay? In chapter 7, he deals with this view of people saying sex is bad or dirty or it's a base desire, okay? And Paul doesn't support that view. He says no, sex is sacred, and he teaches us that it's a gift from God. But in chapter 6, what we just read, he starts the second perspective. And he comes and he unpacks what the assumption was amongst a number of the Corinthians. And he uses some of their own quotes. All things are lawful for me. Food is for the stomach for food. These were common phrases or catchphrases or slogans, right? Like today you might say love is love, or you do you, or whatever it might be. That's what these phrases were. And Paul takes these assumptions and begins to deal with them. And so the fundamental assumption he's dealing with in this text is this idea that sex is primarily just an appetite. It's kind of like eating, right? And so if you have, physical desire for food, you pursue it. If you have a physical desire for sex, you pursue it. It's a natural appetite. And so this debate was significant amongst all places on earth at this time in the city of Corinth, where this letter was written, because the Corinthians were known above all else for one thing, and that was the temple to Aphrodite. And Aphrodite was the Greek and later Roman goddess of lust and passion and pleasure. And so Corinth in particular was heightened in sexual expression. There were thousands, literally thousands of temple prostitutes who would offer their services to the citizens, and it was normal for people to participate in casual sex. And so this young church started to grow in the middle of the city with the temple of Aphrodite, and they're asking Paul, how are we supposed to think about this? How does this all work? That's why he specifically mentions prostitution here, but the principles apply much wider. And so Paul starts with their slogans. Check this out. Because he wants them to identify the cultural assumptions that they're making about sex. And this is really important. Philosopher Charles Taylor calls this the social imaginary. He says that every society has assumptions. Every society has beliefs that have gotten inside the culture to the extent that they're no longer really questioned. They're just assumed. It's just the way things are. It's just what I believe and how I see the world. He calls that the social imaginary. And in this area of sexuality, we all have a social imaginary. We are currently living with a bunch of sort of unquestioned assumptions all around us. And so what are the assumptions that we're making in our time right now? Well, some of the things that are unspoken but generally embraced by many people is that we should define truth and love by how I feel in my heart of hearts. That how I desire or what I desire, my attractions, those are my true self. And when I follow my heart, when I follow my desires, I find who I am, right? I can't make you love me if you don't. I can't make your heart feel something it won't, right? Like, you remember the song? And that idea has kind of gotten into our thinking, like, oh yeah, well, if I feel it, then it's real, it's true. Another part of our social imaginary is that you can separate the physical from the emotional. Like, hey, you can have physical intimacy, but it doesn't require emotional connection or consistency, right? That you can separate these things. We're also told in our context that if you suppress sexual desire, if you don't obey or follow it, you'll never be happy. You'll deny who you really are. These are some of the beliefs, some of the assumptions that are just kind of the air we breathe in our culture. But we have to understand they are unique and they came from somewhere. And so it's worth asking, where did we get these ideas? Now, a social imaginary feels innate. It feels like something that just is. But what we find throughout history and culture is that these ideas grow. They grow from somewhere, and you can actually track the assumptions that our modern Western world makes around sexuality pretty easily. It was Plato who first began to separate the mind and the body, and he said, your body's just a vehicle, your mind is your true self. But then it was many, many years later where French philosopher René Descartes, he said, I think, therefore I am. Took Plato's ideas even further, and basically he was saying your true self is your thoughts or your feelings. 100 years after Descartes, it was Immanuel Kant who said that human consciousness is reality. Now check this out, that your mind is a law unto itself. That the implication of this is you shouldn't adjust your thinking to external realities. You should see the world as a lump of clay that you can mold, and you should try to change external realities based on what you feel or think inside. Now, it was another generation after that Sigmund Freud in the early 1900s began to popularize the idea that the essence of the self, the center of identity, is your sexuality. That sexuality is not something you do, it's someone you are. It's your true self. And so sex is something that you have to pursue in order to discover your true self. Now, Freud was an atheist, and so Freud believed that the universe had no intrinsic meaning or purpose, and so he attached ultimate meaning to the maximization of pleasure in the here and now. Go a little bit further in time, and you begin to read about Margaret Sanger or Wilhelm Reich, who took the ideas of Descartes and Immanuel Kant and Freud and concluded sex is salvation. That if you ever want to be happy, it is impossible if you're not sexually active. And so these ideas have sunk deep down into the way our society thinks, idea upon idea, assumption upon assumption, until eventually they become unquestioned. In 1973, Ernest Becker wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called The Denial of Death. And in it, he said that we're the first society for the last 60 years now. We're the first society with the widespread assumption that there is no afterlife, that we're not actually living for the next life, but that if we want to find purpose, we have to find it here, and we have to find it now. And that pressure, that social pressure to find purpose here and now has led to what Becker called apocalyptic romance. And the idea was that if you fall in love, that is life, that is your life, that without sex or without love or without romance, you aren't really living. And so previous societies, traditional societies, would put pressure on people and say, if you don't have a spouse, if you don't have kids, then you can't be a complete person. Whereas modern society, that one still lingers sometimes, but modern society says if you don't have sex, if you don't have romance, you can't be a complete person. That you have to have it in order to be complete, so your love partner becomes your purpose. And so people go from partner to partner to partner, trying to discover themselves and hopefully finding their true love along the way, right? It's Disney plus Playboy plus Freud. I know it gets a little quiet on Sex Week. But you didn't come to church just to learn a bunch of history, right? The point I'm trying to making is that the assumptions that we hold in our modern context around sexuality, they're not self-evident. They're not intrinsic. Previous generations didn't assume them. They've been learned. They came from somewhere. And so it's important for us to step back, and I know that's hard. When you're swimming in the water, you think everything's water, right? But it's important for us to step back and go, wait a minute, what kind of society are we producing? What kind of world are these assumptions producing? Because if we're this expressive, right? Pornography is more available than any time. Hookup culture is everywhere. Changing sexual norms are everywhere. What kind of world is this producing? Should it be producing, what you would expect, maybe the most sexually satisfied, relational, healthy, internally fulfilled generation in history? Is that what we see when we look around modern society in this area of sex? Oftentimes in our context, it's not even allowed to question the assumptions that we're making, because somehow that itself is suppressive. I want to suggest that when you take an honest look at our world, what you'll find is that there has been a new element that's been added to the assumption, a new element that's been added to the social imaginary, and that is the element of despair. That people now more than ever just expect disappointment. That people now more than ever just expect loneliness, expect isolation, expect a broken heart. And we are in fact becoming more hopeless and more depressed and more isolated and more fragmented and less satisfied and more confused about who we are. Every single metric will tell you that. And so there's more porn than ever. There's more one-night stands than ever. It was supposed to be fun. It was supposed to be freedom. But has it created a society like that? And so what do? I want to tell you today that there are really 4 options. There are 4 options of how we can respond. One way that we can respond, and I think every one of us is, whether we like it or not, or realize it or not, responding in 1 or 2 or more of these ways. The one way to respond is you can say, I'm just blaming them, right? You married the wrong girl. You didn't meet Mr. Right yet. Eventually you'll find them, right? And so, hey, your last boyfriend was a loser, but the next one's going to be great. And so you don't really question the storyline that you're following. Instead, you just kind of keep trying, keep searching. That's what some people are doing. You're on number 4 or 6 or 10 or 12 or 30. And you're going, oh, one day I'll find them. One day I'll find them. That's one way to live. Another way to live is you start to blame yourself. And you go, oh my goodness, everybody else is happy. I looked at Instagram. Their life is perfect, right? But mine is miserable. And what's wrong with me? Self-pity, self-loathing. I'll never find them, right? That's the second option, is you start to blame yourself. So you can blame someone else. You can blame yourself. A third option is you can just blame the world. And you can say, oh, I'll never trust a man again. I hate men. Or I'll never trust a woman again. I hate women, whatever. Some of us, we mix all these together. I'll never trust a man, but I'm looking for Mr. Right. But like all these different things. But there's a fourth option. There's a fourth option, and that is to look at your compass and go, maybe I'm in a blackout zone. Maybe this isn't working right. Maybe my heart isn't quite aligned with reality. Maybe, see, every experienced traveler knows that if you hit a blackout zone, the only way to find where you really are is to look up. And when you get that sun, you know it rises in the east, it sets in the west. At the nighttime, when you get that North Star, you can find the reference point for where you are, not based upon this, but based upon this. You got to look up. And then move in that direction, whether the compass tells you to or not. And it'll lead you home. Sometimes it'll feel like you're headed the wrong way. Sometimes it feels like you're moving away from where you want to go. But eventually it will lead you home. And this is what Paul is urging followers of Jesus to do in this text. And he says something that's really pretty radical, both in his time and in ours. He says the body is not meant for sexual immorality. I want to unpack that phrase. The body is not meant. When he says meant, he's pointing to what you could call divine design. He's telling us that there's an objective order outside of us. That God has created the world in such a way that it has life-creating patterns that produce flourishing in 3 areas, both between you and me, and then between me on the inside with me, and then between society as a whole. Life-flourishing patterns. And Paul says you got to know those patterns. That's why he goes all the way back to the book of Genesis. It's kind of crazy. He immediately quotes Genesis chapter 2. The very beginning of the book to explain his theology around sex. And he's showing us that God from creation produced these patterns that are complementary and when understood bring forth life and reveal his glory. And so he creates heaven, then earth. He creates land, then sea. And then his final creation is man, then woman. And he designs their biology, their psychology, and their spirituality like a lock and a key. And they have a reproductive partnership within themselves. And he gives man and woman the ability to reproduce a genetic pattern that actually creates a new eternal soul. And so God officiates the first wedding and reveals that through this union, he will allow humanity to participate with him in the act of creation. Theologians call this the teleology of the body. The teleology of the body, that word telos means meaning or purpose. And what they're getting at there is they're saying that God put in your biology an arrow to your purpose. That God actually created you with a physical design. And that's intended to teach you about something. And so Jesus, when he talks about marriage and divorce, Jesus goes right back to creation just like Paul did. Look what he does in Matthew 19. This is Jesus. He says, haven't you read? They asked him about marriage, asked him about divorce. He said, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning, the Creator, right back to Genesis 2, made them male and female. And he said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. One flesh. We'll get back to that phrase in a second, but one flesh. Notice that Jesus here, he does something that's pretty countercultural. He considers Scripture his source of authority on sexuality. He doesn't consider his feelings or his desires or the culture or experience or modern philosophy. And he tells us that God made us male and female. And then he says this is all part of God's plan. And then he created sex for this union that he calls marriage. And so Paul, aligning with this teaching from Jesus, says flee sexual immorality. Run away from it. Stay far from it. What does sexual immorality mean? It's the Greek word, it's a single word. In the Greek, it's the Greek word porneia. You can imagine what English words we get from the Greek word porneia. Take a guess. But porneia means sexual acts outside of this marriage commitment between a man and a woman. So in our modern context, that is very contradictory to our social imaginary, right? And that's what has made the Christian sex ethic unpopular for generations. Exclusive devotion to one person in marriage, no sleeping around, no multiple partners, no digital partners. Like, this is too limiting, this is unhealthy. What if it means that I have to deny how I really feel or what I want or what I desire? Jesus wouldn't make me abandon my true self, would he? Well, notice the assumptions that are under that statement. And then notice what Jesus says in Matthew 16. Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Now, Jesus is not about just robbing you of joy here. In fact, this verse is Jesus' road to joy, not to lose joy. What he's saying here, check this out, is that sin has gotten into your system and it's caused your magnetic field to get confused. And so now your compass is unreliable. And so you have to look up to the sun and see reality beyond what you think and feel and want and desire. But his call to look up is not to rob you. His call to look up is not to steal pleasure from you. But he says that if you'll lose your life, you're going to find life. His purpose is to bless you, to heal you, to help you, and to free you. That's what he's after. And for some of us, this will be the hardest step of faith in our lives, the most challenging step of faith in our life, to believe that following God's limited, narrow vision for sexuality is actually best for me and brings glory to him. And so Paul starts to untangle our assumptions. And I want to do it with you because these can be a little complicated. The first thing he tells us is that sex is not the most important thing in your life. Look what he says in verse 14. And God raised the Lord and will also raise us up by his power. Now, in the context, that is a really weird thing to say. He's in the middle of talking about prostitutes and about sexual immorality and flee this and don't do that. And it's not just an appetite. And now let's talk about the resurrection of Jesus. And it's like, wait, what? Why would you do that? It's a little counterintuitive, but it's actually very helpful. He does it again in chapter 7. A few verses later, he says, the present form of this world is passing away. What's Paul trying to get at here? He's trying to get at our here and now assumption. That I need to find ultimate pleasure here and now. And what Paul wants you to see is that if you believe this thing, it means that you're an eternal being with an eternal purpose. That you're going to live 40 or 60 or 80 or 90 years on this earth, and then you're going to live hundreds of millions of billions of years in the next life. And if you actually believe that, it should radically change the way you think about pleasure now. It should radically change how you aim your life now. For Paul, this was real. It wasn't like a theory or a concept. It was real to him. That life is more than the here and now. But you are living in what theologians call the overlap of the ages. That Christ has come, he has died, he has risen, and he one day will return, but he hasn't yet returned. And so you're living with the Spirit of Jesus in the body of Adam. And that means the flesh and the spirit are at war in you. And so you are going to experience that tension. And it requires that you resist when your flesh cries out for something that your spirit condemns. That fight will come to you. I don't care who you are. Every single one of us will experience it. And so some of us, we think of spirituality and Christianity and we go, well, I don't want to resist my true desires. I don't want to discipline myself in this way or that or suppress who I really am. Dallas Willard said it like this: to undertake the disciplines is to take our activities, our lives seriously. And to suppose, check this out, that following Christ is at least as big a challenge as playing the violin or jogging. Now, I'm not trying to be trite here, but he's got a point. What he's saying is some of us are like, you'll play the violin and practice like crazy and get so good, and it's discipline, discipline, discipline. Then when it comes to our sexuality, you say, well, I can't create any limits. I can't deprive myself, right? And he's saying, hey, it's going to be at least as challenging as playing the violin. I would suggest slightly more challenging, but I don't play the violin, so I don't know for sure. What's he trying to say? He's trying to say that if you really believe this, then eternity has to change the way you think about sex. If Jesus really rose from the dead, then it has to shift what I value and how I see myself. And it goes against a very bedrock part of our social imaginary, and that is that sex equals identity. And Jesus is saying, no, sex equals identity doesn't make any sense. And I would tell you today that sex equals identity doesn't make sense spiritually, but it also doesn't even make sense naturally. Like, zoom out for a moment, okay? Think of it this way. According to studies, a healthy sexually active couple, we're about to get real, this is the data, is having sex 1 to 3 times per week, okay? The average sexual experience, according to the data, is 3 to 7 minutes. This is the data. This means that a healthy couple, dang, it got real in church today. This means that a healthy couple is actually having sex 15 minutes a week. Do you know how many minutes are in a week? I do. 10,080 minutes. So zooming out from our current assumptions, does an individual base his or her absolute identity on the 15 minutes or on the 10,065 other minutes? Maybe we're a little confused, friends. Maybe we're a little out of sorts. And so thank you, praise the Lord. And so he goes even deeper. Come on, stay with it, get with it. You're good people. Or do you not know, verse 16, that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? We're going deeper. For as it is written, the two become one flesh, but he who is joined to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Flee sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against their own body. What does this mean? Well, Paul is saying here that even though sex is not an ultimate thing, it is also much more than a physical thing. He says that the one who sleeps with another one is actually joined. It's the word for fusion in metal, that if you melt down two metals, bring them together, they are fused into one. He says that when you are sexually intimate, you are welded or you are fused, and science actually supports this. Science tells us that when you sleep with someone, your body is actually making a promise, even if your mind or your heart aren't making that promise. Chemicals in you create a bond with that person. And so dopamine intensifies your focus, norepinephrine marks your memory, oxytocin welds the two of you together. And so biologically, long-term attachment after sex is actually a part of your chemistry. And so when someone says, oh, you can have sex and not be emotionally entangled, both biology and scripture would say, no, you can't. You can't do it. You can try your best, but it will not work. And so when the body speaks of one flesh, it's talking more than just physical union. It's telling us that God actually designed sex as a bonding agent within marriage to work as a part of whole life commitment. That God's plan for human flourishing was to take these two people and bind them together, not in one area, but in every area. In their finances, in their future plans, in their desire to have children, not have children, in their social activities, in their physical union. All of these different elements, we would be bound together. And so God gives them this gift of sex to say, I belong to you exclusively. And when it's used that way, it is wonderful. But when it's not used that way, when we say, no, I'll give my body, but I want to maintain my own independence, I'm not willing to commit my whole self to you, sex actually starts working backwards. And so now, rather than becoming a bonding agent, sex actually causes fragmentation and isolation, where I start to lose pieces of who I am until I'm not really sure who I am anymore. It starts costing me my very self. This is why Paul says that the one who sins sexually sins against his own body. You're actually causing your own fragmentation. And so Paul here, he's saying sex is more than physical, it's spiritual, and it's actually a picture of God. One fully devoted husband, one fully devoted wife, one fully devoted God come together to make life. This is Genesis. This is the story. It's a picture of the Trinity. And so it is so sacred, so sacred. But it's crazy because right after Paul gives us the highest human philosophy of sexuality ever presented to any culture or religion, he then startles us and says, oh, and by the way, Christians can live perfectly fulfilling lives without sex. And it's like, wait, what? I thought you said it was this sacred, amazing, glorious thing. And he says, oh, yeah, it is. It is. But it's not the way that you get a real identity. It's one of the ways that God images himself, one of the ways that he displays his glory in the world, but it's not the way that you get your real identity. Paul chose to remain single. Jesus, the most complete person to ever live, was celibate and single. And so it's not the way you get your real identity. See, according to the Bible, staying single and not having sex is a perfectly fulfilling option for the follower of Christ. You're not missing out on real life, even though the world might tell you you are. Because the real secret to life is not found in getting married or staying single. The real secret to life is to make Christ your one true love. Verse 19, or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you? This is so countercultural. Whom you have from God, you're not your own. You were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. Make Christ your one true love. Whether you're married, whether you're single, whether you're divorced, wherever you find yourself right now, make Christ your one true love. And if you're married and your marriage is wonderful, it will allow you to not make your wife or your husband your idol. And if your marriage is miserable, it will allow you to sustain and be faithful even when things are difficult. And if you're single and you're alone and frustrated, it will empower you to find the strength to remain. Make Christ your one true love. In John chapter 4, there's a story, you may be familiar with it, of a woman at a well. And Jesus finds this woman and he offers her living water. And the woman wants the living water. He's talking about eternal life, fulfillment, satisfaction, ultimate purpose. He says, I want to give you living water. And the woman says, yes, I want that. And he says, go get your husband. And the woman says, oh, I don't have a husband. And she says, Jesus goes, well, that's true. You've had 5 husbands, and now you've been divorced from all 5, and you're living with a guy, and he's not your husband. He exposes her brokenness in this romantic area of sexuality. But why would Jesus connect the living water to this woman's sexual sin? He does it because he wanted her to see, and by the way, he wants us to see, that what our hearts look for in a lover can only be found in him. That this is what our hearts long for most. That God wants to lead you into a spiritual intimacy, much deeper than sexuality, where he answers the question of identity, where he answers the question of purpose and value, where he heals you, where he rewrites the story of who you are and why you are, where he untangles the false assumptions that you've made about yourself and about the world, and where he makes you whole. And this only happens when we come to him and we say, God, I think this thing might be broken. I think it doesn't tell me reliably who I am or where I'm going. I need you, and I want to follow you and trust you and give you my dreams and my brokenness and my past and my future. And when we do that, he starts working. See, some of us, we hear this and we go, well, that's nice, Justin, for other people, but it's not nice for me. It's too late for me. I've been on this road for a long time. I've done this, I've done that. It's not going to happen for me. Pause. Hold on a second. Was it too late for the woman at the well? She had been divorced 5 times and was now living with a guy, and yet Jesus offers her living water. Do you realize what that means for you? Was it too late for Jacob, who idolized his wife and made her his whole purpose, and God had to teach him otherwise? Was it too late for Gomer, who cheated on her husband again and again and again and again, and yet the Lord still redeemed her and saved her? Was it too late for David, who committed adultery against his wife and never was satisfied sexually? On and on and on. The Bible is full of people who were confused and disobedient to God, and then they ran to him and were healed and found their one true love. And so just like in a marriage, true intimacy, check this out, requires the loss of independence. This is true with God. Your life is not your own. That's what Paul just said. If you want to have intimacy with God, you have to lose your independence. You can't say, I want to be intimate with you, but I want to be independent of you. Doesn't work. True intimacy requires the loss of your independence. You have to surrender your plan. You have to surrender your will. And this is where a lot of Christians struggle, because we think, well, gosh, surrender like that to God? The loss of my independence? How could I ever do that? Well, that's the most amazing part of the gospel. And it's that God went first. That God couldn't have intimacy with us without losing his independence. And so God, the invisible, transcendent creator of the cosmos, became a human being. And he did that forever. He will forever be tied to flesh and blood. God and man have come to be one in Christ. And right now, Christ is still fully God and fully man in heaven. And according to the scripture, he always will be. Theologian Wayne Grudem, he said it like this. He said, Jesus did not temporarily become man. His divine nature was permanently united to his human nature, and he lives forever, not just as the eternal Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, but as Jesus, the man who was born of Mary. Jesus will remain fully God and fully man, yet one person forever. What does that mean? It means that spiritually, God has already said, I do. He has already committed eternally to you. He's become vulnerable. And when he died on the cross to save you, he embraced full vulnerability, giving up his own life so that you could have union with him. And therefore, Paul says, therefore, you're not your own anymore. Don't get physically naked without committing to whole life vulnerability in marriage. Don't take God's gift of sex and try to extract out the pleasure while you ignore God's pattern, because it will not work. Don't trust your inner compass to define love and truth, but trust the sun that tells you north is that way, go that way, and stay that way. This is the call of this community of faith. And what kind of community does it produce? It does not produce a self-righteous, judgmental, condemning community. In fact, in the early church, there was a letter that was passed around describing the early Christians that were experiencing Christ and coming out of places like Corinth and living differently. And this is how they described the early Christians. They said, as citizens, they share in all things with others and yet endure all things as if foreigners. And so what's he trying to get us to understand? They're kind of like in this world, but they're not of this world, like what we've been saying. They marry, as do all others. They beget children, but they don't destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They're in the flesh, but they're not living after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they're citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws, and at the same time, they surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men. They're persecuted by all. They're evil spoken of, yet justified. They're reviled, and yet they bless. They're insulted, and they repay the insult with honor. So he's trying to describe this weird thing called the church. And he says it's crazy because the Romans, they wouldn't share their tables, but they would share their beds. But the Christians, they share their tables with anyone, but they don't share their beds with anybody but their spouse. They're living a different kind of life. What kind of life it is? It's a life reoriented around eternity. It's a life that surrenders to God's purpose and plan beyond what my compass tells me. It's a life that trusts him. And when we come across people who disagree with us or think we're crazy or think we're even judging them, we invite them to the table. We practice radical hospitality. And we love even those who see us as enemies. This is the goal of the church. And so maybe you're here and you're hearing this vision of sexuality and you're going, oh, I don't agree with that. I'm offended by that. Well, you're welcome to stay. You're welcome to stay. Jesus consistently welcomed those who saw sexuality different than him. He treated them with compassion and he invited them to trust him. But he doesn't command Christians to love people to change people. He commands Christians to love people just to love people, to leave the changing to God. And so as a church family, what's our posture? Grace and truth. That we preach the truth and we welcome everyone. Grace and truth. And you might say, that's quite the tension. It sure is. It sure is quite the tension. And it's the tension that we live in. I read a story recently about a high wire acrobat. In 1974, he walked 140 feet across a tightrope that was stretched between the two Twin Towers in New York City. He was 1,368 feet off the ground. And after he reached the other side, the interviewer asked him, what was the most difficult moment? He said something that caught my attention. He said, the most difficult moment is when my front foot was on the wire and my back foot was still on the first building. And he said, and the most difficult moment was when I chose to shift my weight. I knew I had a long way to go still. I knew I still had to walk all the way across that 140-foot chasm. But the most difficult moment, the Lord's talking to somebody right now, was when I had to shift my weight. I think God's calling somebody here to shift your weight. To shift the weight of your life. From your way to his way. From your plan to his plan. From what you can see to what you can't see. That's the decisive moment. Still got a long road. But it starts when you shift your weight. And say, God, I think my compass doesn't work that well all the time. And I need you to guide me. I want to invite you to stand. Take a moment, close your eyes, and just reflect. Maybe you're holding on to secrets in this area that are eating you alive. Maybe you're struggling with shame. Maybe you really regret some decisions you made in the past. There are so many applications to this. We could do a 16-week series. And right now, I just want to invite you, wherever you find yourself, to turn to Christ. Deuteronomy 33 says, the eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. It's one of my favorite passages in the Bible. Underneath what? Underneath all of your choices, underneath all your mistakes, underneath all your fears, underneath all your problems, underneath all your desires, underneath all your challenges, there are these everlasting arms. It's your one true love. Collapse into those arms. Just run into those arms and say, God, I need you to tell me who I really am. And I need you to heal me. Let's pray. Father, in the name of Jesus, I pray that you would, even right now, write your vision for us on our hearts. And I pray that as we take these moments to respond in song, I pray that you would meet us in surrender, in desperation, in brokenness, in a need for strength to walk away from temptation, whatever our circumstances might be right now, would you meet us? In Jesus' name.